I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Now, how do you pronounce your last name? Because if I butchered it, I apologize.
No, it's exactly as it sounds. Kogan.
Great. Dr. Kogan, I'm so glad to have you here today. How you doing? What's going on? Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from Miami. The sweater would suggest otherwise, but it's
Uh,
like a strangely cold day here. Uh, yeah, I was on the beach 2 days ago, so this is odd.
The times we live in, right? It's warmer. It's 75 degrees in New York City right now.
Yeah, it's cold here. Crazy.
Oh, wild. So, Alex, before we jump into the questions, can you tell me a little bit about your background and your career journey, and how maybe it brought you to this point where we'll be talking about these technologies today?
Yeah, so I started out in academia. I went and did a PhD, and then I was a professor for 6 years. And what I studied was kind of at the interface of psychology and computer science, which is very relevant to today's subject. And so about 6 years into my academic career, I kind of looked out over at Silicon Valley and said, man, there's some really exciting stuff happening there. I want to get in on that. So I quit my job and came out to San Francisco and got into startups. Started a couple of companies, have been working with the high operative for a long time. And I think sort of the arc I've gone through is really thinking for a long time about, like, as NLP technologies improved, and you could think of ChatGPT and LLMs as sort of the extension of that research. Where's it all going to go? What kind of impact will it have on work? What kind of impact will it have on young people? And it's happening. It's happening a lot faster than I expected, but it's here, and it's going to be real.
Isn't it wild how it's just like it felt overnight?
Yeah, totally. And it's the folks that have been closer to it, like we've had access to the APIs for about 2 years, but there was like GPT-3, and then like for 2 years, nothing much. And then 3.5 got API'd, and like 2 weeks later, 4 came out. So just the pace, and then Google released this PaLM recently. The pace is suddenly really hit hard. And I think it is that the ChatGPT moment was so important because it brought it into sort of the public eye, and folks became much more aware of it. And that pushed everybody else to the table, right? OpenAI said, hey, we're going to plant our flag and become the company. That's made Google move and be like, no, we're going to get in on this as well, because we've been building this for a decade. And other players are just immediately emerging. So it's going to be a really wild ride for the next 12, 24 months as kind of all the players come to the table.
Right. And I think that's an excellent point. You said, like, Google's like, hey, we've been doing this for a decade. We've been working on this probably longer, but like maybe actually like you've been aware of it that we've been working on for a decade. I have a phone that I talk to. I have an assistant with a speaker. Like, these things have been around, but we're like, oh, you can turn on the lights and maybe give me some information about Wikipedia, or say you don't know, or whatever. So it never has really felt like that, the sci-fi movie that we all kind of dream about and we see and we're like, that seems cool. But now this technology and the hardware, they are coexisting in it apparently in like 2 different locations. But I feel like, this is kind of jumping ahead, like where we think it's going to go. But like, isn't this technology already in my house, or the hardware's in my house, but the technology is going to be going there?
Depends on the exact details. To build these models is really expensive and uses a lot of hardware. To run it is it's also pretty intensive. You're not running it on your smartphone just yet. I'm not sure if you will, because a lot of the breakthrough hasn't been like, hey, we figured out a more clever way to do math. It's just been, we could get way bigger now with the model sizes, and just surprises happen. They've leveled up, just like, let's make it 10 times bigger and another 10 times bigger. It started to like behave in this really surprising human-like manner. And then there's been like obviously refinements to the way they think about the frameworks, but I think it's a lot of uncharted water, and people are going at it, and it's the results are remarkable right now.
Yeah. And I'm very curious too about, so, this concept of, so Google's been working on this, other people are working on it for like a decade. ChatGPT, like you said, planted the flag. So was there they kicked the door open with something that they had been working on and made it public. And do you think now that everyone's jumping in, is it because they were just waiting to release the thing until they thought it was ready, but now everyone's gung-ho because they don't want to seem like last in the race?
That's exactly right. I think my impression is if Google had its way, it would not be releasing as an API right now. It wouldn't release BART. I think folks are feeling their hand forced because it feels like, oh no, the race is on right now, and you got to get a product to market because there's already product to market, and you don't want to be last or you don't want to be fifth, right? Especially if you've got some of the best stuff. So yeah, I mean, a lot of things are coming to the market right now that are untested, unproven, potentially dangerous. There's not a lot of understanding of the broader consequences of all this. So it's a remarkable time. I mean, I think like, to me, this strikes me as the moments like the web browser, when the web browser arrived and it had this Cambrian like explosion of websites and functionality, and like, you didn't really know how it was going to shake out. Forever, like Jeff Bezos, there was like 1,000 other folks that just completely failed that we don't know about anymore. I think that's where we're at. We're just going to see that surge right now. And it's going to be a lot of half-baked stuff, but it'll still be pretty remarkable.
Right. And it's so interesting to see, like you said, we don't really know how it's going to shake out. And yet everyone's putting it into whatever they already have. Like, okay, now there's a feature where you can like, Bing has this thing and Google has this thing. And now when I'm like, have a question with customer support, it's going to be a little more organic because they're adopt. So it's just going to be all over the place, right? There's going to be so much variation rather.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if we start diving into like, where can you use this realistically? So high operators in the customer service space, like a lot of what we've done is we took a white collar job and we tried to make it faster, right? We built a lot of automations that take like tasks that people aren't so great at, such as attention to detail and math, and we made it much more seamless, sort of a button click. But what we didn't have was, well, how do you add empathy? How do you make sure if somebody writes in and says like, hey, my dog died, you acknowledge that, right? Like that's really difficult to code in. GPT-4 now does a great job at that. And so we very quickly move to like insert it in, and then like that eliminates that job for customer service agents. So that's 3 million jobs in the United States. I think you're going to see this story over and over and over again in many white collar jobs. Anything that's like even remotely repetitive and isn't super creative is going to go away. So things like copy editing is going to get hit hard. A lot of legal stuff has a chance of being a hit, especially like sort of the low to middle tiers. Some of the basic journalism could get hit hard. Like a good buddy of mine is a reporter for one of the top newspapers, and immediately he was like, can we write news stories this way? And we just set up an experiment where like, yeah, we could generate pretty interesting sports news stories that are highly accurate by doing a couple of tricks, but like just as good, right? Like you can't really tell the difference between that and a writer, but it's 1,000th the cost. So if you're in a job where you're mostly at a computer and you're mostly interacting with text, which is many US jobs, this is going to be incredibly disruptive. And so I think there's huge questions of its consequences, both positive and negative, that are going to unfold, and we're going to watch.
We're going to watch and we're going to experience it, right? And I feel like every time, like you said, like the web browser, the web browser, that was disruptive to a lot of industries. We go further back, we look at, assembly lines, we look at any really sort of technology. It's very disruptive to a lot of people that work, and yet we figure it out, we catch up, but some people are left behind and some people really profit from these things. And so like, what's that middle ground for a lot of folks?
Yeah, so it's hard to know, right? Like the analogy I really like is like the switchboard. Like when we used to call people, there was a job where you were like, who are you calling? Let me connect it up, right? And that went away. And that was a much better experience for the people calling, right? It just was. But that job just went away, and it wasn't a bad job. And like, what does that person do? It's not like obvious how that job gets replaced. So I think when we start thinking about like, what are the consequences, the winners and losers, as consumers, we're going to win a lot. right? We're going to just have better experiences. Just like, let's just zoom in on the customer service example. The GPT powered customer service agents doesn't sleep. They're always available. They're always polite. They don't have bad days. So as a consumer, I get my response right away. I'm able to find out where is my package. I could get my refund. I could cancel my order, right? All that stuff immediately. I don't have to wait 24 hours. I don't have to worry about like, hey, is this person going to be fully trained, right? That's better for the consumer. It's going to be better for the company that's providing the product that you're asking the support about, because customer service costs less now. But for the 3 million folks that were doing that job, it's unclear to me where they go. I think many people will go down in terms of wage, because if you like, here's what's not getting disrupted: jobs that have a physical component. So if you are doing something that's a bit more white collar, like customer service, but like it's kind of, you don't go to school for this, it's a really easy skill to pick up on the job. A lot of folks in those roles, I fear, are going to go down to food and bev, retail, and warehousing. Things where you're still, but those jobs are much more physically demanding, and they pay less. So, I mean, like you've seen that, like if you zoom out, you've seen the story in the United States of greater inequality over the last 50 years, both just from the Gini index, but looking at the middle class shrinking, CEO to sort of frontline. I think you're going to see even more of that, because it's creating greater and greater leverage for the companies to provide a better experience to their customers. But that layer of people that are kind of greasing the wheels can go away. And that's a lot of consequences. And I think, like, I don't know that they're going to be all that positive from a labor perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can definitely hear how some of these folks, if you're at a computer, customer service, those jobs are going to, these folks, that job market will be hurt. You said, like wages might go down because it's so much cheaper to automate that stuff. Some of the CEOs will benefit from this, but who in the workforce will benefit from this? I can see how the consumers can benefit from this. Like you said, oh, easier experience. I don't, sometimes when I'm on a customer service call, they're helping 20 people at once, right? On a chat now, right? Like chat, now my experience with going online to chat takes just as long as a phone call would, because there's still a human managing, I don't even know how many chats at once,
Right. So I think a lot of who's going to benefit from as an employee.
Yeah.
So first, you're going to benefit if you are relying on a team to produce stuff for you, that now you could just have far greater efficiency, right? So the customer service managers, right? It's much easier. Your hiring is simplified. Like, so one of the biggest problems I think a lot of companies have experienced in the last 3 years has been hiring, just getting talent in the door, training, retaining. If those issues start to go away, the folks sort of at the managerial level and up have an easier time, for sure. Then, like, if we start talking about creative tasks, like I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, they love ChatGPT. It's just sort of the dream come true. Anytime they need something like, hey, I need a new marketing slogan, right? Sort of any sort of that creative work. Here's 20 examples, like, ooh, I like this one. Let me piece these together, right? So folks in those roles can go much quicker, can iterate much more quickly. You'll just need fewer of them, right? So it's going to become like sort of like superhumans. I like to think of it as like the Iron Man suit, right? Now you've got Jarvis in there, and like you could do a lot more as Iron Man, but you'll need just fewer Iron Men, and that's kind of.
And again, as you're saying that, I'm like, well, what about all these people that work as marketing firms, and their whole job was to come up with 20 examples, and they would charge you $20,000, and it took a week. And now it's like, just give me 20 things. It's like, so again, there's like a whole body of people that are like, that's kind of what we do. Yeah, and it's creative.
It's gonna go away. If we push this further, so in the United States, we have this issue of literacy. So about 53% of Americans don't read at a 6th grade reading level. That's going to get worse, because like the first place where we saw folks start using ChatGPT was schools, right? Like within like 3 weeks of ChatGPT coming out, kids starting submitting their homework using ChatGPT generated essays. A company emerged that would help schools detect whether the essay was written by ChatGPT, and another company emerged that would help kids take an essay written by ChatGPT and rewrite it so it was undeductible by that second company. This is like 3 weeks, right?
It's so bonkers and I love it. It's so bonkers.
But if you run this through, it's, you know, kids are kids, and a lot of them will opt out of doing the hard work because they think they're just doing an assignment. They're not realizing, no, this is to create a skill for you so you could read and write at a high level.
Right.
So the way that's going to be used by kids in schools is, I think, pretty alarming, because like, how much worse is literacy going to get here? And that's going to be one of the key metrics, because like, that's the future workforce. That's who's going to be working in 10, 20 years. Or these are the folks that are going to be exiting colleges in 5 years. And what does that look like for employers? And I think that's going to be one of the sort of downstream consequences we're going to have to really watch to see how it unfolds. And it'll be really interesting. Like, I don't want to be a policymaker right now, because you've got one of the most daunting moments possible, because you got to really make some moves, because doing nothing has huge consequences, doing something has huge consequences. And I bet different countries will elect to do different things. So we're going to see these natural experiments unfold in the US, China, Europe, and we'll see what happens. But I don't know that we're going to have, we will certainly not have the workforce we have today in another 10, 20 years because of these technologies.
Yeah. And we could do a whole summit on how this affects education, you know, of just like, there's, especially in America, if you're listening in from America, we're not really known for having the best education programs in our schooling, unfortunately. And you know, that's a whole other can of worms. Just like, do we need to be more, I mean, the short answer is yes, more hands-on with our students, and being, you know, it's going to be completely, I think, change the relationship to homework, as opposed to doing things in classroom with a teacher, seeing you do it, as opposed to like, go off and do these math problems, write this essay, read this report. All of that can be, you know, aided, helped, cheated with, however you want to describe it, with these tools.
Totally. And I think like, if you'll let me cook on this for a little bit more.
Please. Smells good. The soup. You're cooking in the soup.
So, one of the things I had in my head for about the last 7 years is a video game where it could just generate stories of the type you want. You know, I'm a big Battlestar Galactica fan. I would love to play a role-playing game for 100 hours continuing the story of Battlestar Galactica. And we already have the technology to create a galaxy where there's billions of stars, and every star has planets, and every planet is planet size. We could visit it all. There are games where you could do this. It's incredible. But they're all devoid of any meaning because there's no stories. And I'm like, well, if you could write the stories. The technology has arrived that allows you to write these stories. So, and this company will emerge, right? Without a doubt, within 5 years, we will have a video game where you'll just be like, this is the sort of stories I like, please give me content. And these games will adapt to you. So as you're interacting with them, they'll adapt to you and the story will change. But if you're going back and you're like a teenager, you could either exist in the real world and deal with the hard emotions of rejection and like trying to navigate others, or you could be literally the king of your own galaxy, where everyone is catering to you. And I think that will have profound impact on sort of just how adjusted is the next generation? How well can they interact with others? We already have this huge question of coming out of COVID of like, do we lose a little bit the ability to people work together and figure out sort of like those interpersonal struggles at work? How does that impact teams, right? So all those things are going to like, and it all stems from this core innovation of the LLM and what it can do and all these incredible experiences they unlock. But it really reshapes who we are as people and how we grow up and how we learn to behave and interact. Interesting times.
Very interesting times. And like, who's to say there won't be another period when we're in lockdown for 3 years and this is completely more advanced, like you said, and then we're just completely immersed in our own worlds. That could happen. It could also maybe somehow bring us together in a way that we can't predict yet. It's like you said, it's the Wild West, right? So what are some things that we have 10 minutes left? you and I could clearly talk about this for hours because I love talking about this. And we're just like, what about this? What about this? What about this?
Yes.
So like, what about things that haven't been explored yet in the workplace? A lot of our listeners are workforce people, so where do you see this maybe could go in unexplored ways that it's not being used yet?
So I think the easiest stuff is going to be the really rote stuff, right? And the really creative things, like give like the marketing examples, right? Those are pretty straightforward. I think legal is really interesting to me because there's a lot of compliance around it, right? And you need to get it right. So like one of the problems we have with these LLMs is they lie. It's the technical term is hallucination. The more honest version is bullshitting.
Yeah. Also, why hallucination? That's like trippy. I was like, who microdosed and came up with that one?
So it's a good scientific term.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like that's a big issue, right? So like for when you're dealing with creative things, who cares? When you're dealing with things that are more factual, it's really important. Well, two things are happening right now. One is the model is getting better at being or more resistant to hallucinations. Like GPT-4 is much better than GPT-3 at this. So that's great, right? So they're starting to be better. Number two, a lot of companies are building apparatuses to mitigate this risk, right? Like if you're building a company today and you're going to be like, I'm going to be an LLM app, really what that means is I'm going to use GPT-4 or whatever else, and I'm going to wrap it in a layer of software, but the software's primary function is going to be one, to give you an interface, and number two, to keep that thing on the rails so it doesn't lie to you. So that's going to get better and better and better. And like if we start having more predictable facts and sort of outputs that are fact-based, yeah, legal gets really, really interesting. Because that's a huge source of cost for companies. And I think like if legal becomes cheap, what can you unlock, right? Starting a businesses gets easier. A lot of sort of contracting gets easier. And so that's good. I think to me, that's like huge industry that maybe is a year or two away from being really started to get disrupted. And it'll be interesting how the law follows.
Yeah. What are some misconceptions about this? Do you think that the general public has about AI, ChatGPT? What are some things that you think are just wrong?
So I think one misconception, and this is going to be a very controversial one.
Oh, give it to me.
Is that it doesn't think. I think folks have repeated over and over again, it's not really thinking, it's it's just a trick, right? And the reason I bring this one up is, like, I'm a psychologist by training. We don't really know what thinking is. So it's hard to be like, this is not it, if we can't even like know what the thing is to begin with.
Right.
Our brains are neural networks, right? LLMs are artificial neural networks. They're based on how our brains are structured. And our brains are this magical thing where you've got, trillions of neurons and quadrillions of connections. And somehow from that, you get you and me and consciousness and sort of self-awareness and everything, right? We don't know how that works. And so to say with certainty, oh, this thing is not doing that at some reptilian level, I'm not confident in that. And I think a lot of the alarmism that you're starting to hear is folks that maybe share my view of they're just not sure. And they're not sure when it'll happen. If we 10x the model again, do you get self-awareness and consciousness? And so that's, I think, I would combat that. I think folks probably have folks who are lay will probably believe that the folks building these models have a far greater understanding of how they work and what they're doing than they do. And I think a lot of these questions are unclear as they really answer.
Right. Well, we only have a few minutes left. I do want to touch on if you have any thoughts on, there was a recent study released, I think just yesterday in the Times and flying around the blogs, just how much energy all of this is using too, and how much water this is using. Because we're like, oh, it's so innovation, and you made this really good point about this isn't running off my phone. This isn't running on a browser. These are giant machines that are like, when you think of like computers in the 1970s, it's like, that's what we're doing right now again, with just a new level of leveling up, as you said, of scaling up. So there's so much energy and water being used on this thing, but like, I would never know that as a user unless I read it in the New York Times or wherever.
Yeah, totally. So it's just to give people a sense of scale. So GPT-3, which is substantially smaller than GPT-4, they released a price tag. So to train the model once, right? And they had to do this a bunch of times because they kept iterating and making mistakes, but to train it one time, it cost them $5 million in compute, right? That's like, in terms of paying on Google, whoever they were using at the time for like servers, that's a lot of compute. That's really, really a lot of compute. So, and that's to train the model once. There are estimates that to run, ChatGPT was costing them 100 grand a day. Again, just in server costs. A day, right? And this is like 1 million users. We're not anywhere near a global scale where people are using this every day for everything. So the energy footprint is going to be enormous because these are very, very large models. The offset to that is the work and the functions that are being displaced probably are even more energy intensive because it's like you and me and like millions of other people doing work, and we also eat up a lot of energy, right? That's kind of like the trade-off. Now, it's a bit of a false trade-off because we're still alive and we're going to still use that energy, knock on wood, right? So that's kind of the crazy consequence. But I think that as you're getting into these newer technologies, they are truly super energy intensive. I think the one thing I'll say that's better for things like the LLMs compared to crypto, because like crypto is also incredibly energy intensive, but here we have clear applications, right? These are clear value adds to society as far as things we can do for that energy cost. Whereas like something like crypto, it's still really uncertain. Like what can we do with it for how energy intensive it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So in these last couple of minutes, Dr. Alex, can you share a little bit about how your company uses AI in its work? I'd love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, so at our core, we knew we were going to try to automate and speed up customer service, right? Because it was this dream of like, how do we make it that when you're chatting, you get an immediate response, and then this thing knows everything and it can access all of your files. So we started with very much this Iron Man concept of there's going to be a human in the loop, and that we're going to have the people be really good at empathy and talk to people, but everything else we're going to automate. So like if you email in, you're like, hey, I want to know where my order is. Here's the number. Our software would go look up all those details and come back to the agent and say like, hey, here are all the details. And here's a pre-written message that you could send over. So the agent didn't have to do anything. But we built it in a flexible manner where that step where the agent, the human being, would come in could be swapped out. And so we started swapping that out and having the AI come in and basically tell the AI, hey, here's what the customer wrote in. Here's all the facts. Please write a response. And gave it a bit more guidance on top of that. But like the result was pretty astounding where the responses are really good. And when I started to show it to my clients made this observation where like, this is better than the humans, where we're not just talking about like human level. They're like, this is better writing and more empathetic than what we're getting from the human agents. And that was kind of a big aha moment for us of like, this is not just a human replacement. It's like, it's just a generally better experience with the deep consequences of labor loss. So that's kind of where we're at. We're kind of pushing along. Now, I will say, it's not just plug it in and it's done. We've had to do an enormous amount of work to try to keep it on the rails, because once you can talk to this thing about anything and there's no human involved, like you got to make sure you're not going to have it like go talk about highly inappropriate things or try to tell you like, hey, I canceled your subscription for this other company that like isn't the company you're writing in about, right? And like, so all of that is tricky, but that's sort of like taking the GPT tiger and making sure you keep it on the rails and it doesn't go run amok. But I think that's going to be the model for a lot of companies right now trying to apply the technology.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to like highlight I would say just like, whoo, that was spicy, is that you're saying that the AI was bringing in more empathy for the user than a human. It was like, ooh, wow, that is wild life that we're in right now. Dr. Alex Kogan, I want to talk to you all the time. How can I stay connected with you? How can our listeners keep the conversation going with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. That's the best way to reach me. And I'm always happy to chat. This stuff is deep passion.
And if I write you on LinkedIn, is it you or is it a chat bot that's writing me back?
Sadly, you won't know the difference.
All right, my friend. I hope we get to do this again. Thank you so much for your time today. This was fantastic.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Have a good one.